Everyone says China today is unbelievably powerful. Powerful enough, some say, to become the next ruler of the world. Really? I don't see it that way. Yes, China is powerful in a certain way. It is powerful at scale, powerful at replication, terrifyingly good at taking something that already exists and pushing it to the extreme. Factory system, test performance, manufacturing chains, platform imitation, product optimization, cost compression, speed, volume, execution. Once the model is there, once the path is visible, once the structure has already been proven somewhere, China can enter the game and push that thing from 1 to 99 with astonishing force, sometimes to 100, sometimes beyond 100, all the way into overproduction, oversaturation, and collapse. But once you see that clearly, another question becomes unavoidable. How about 0 to 1? Well, a society that does not allow trial and error, does not tolerate chaos, does not respect imagination, does not permit stagnation, does not survive uncertainty, does not reward non-linear movement, and does not forgive turning away from the approved path, is a society that has already crashed most of the conditions required from 0 to 1 creation. If at the level of society this still feels too abstract, then look at the developmental path of almost every Chinese child. Look at what is actually happening from the beginning. A society that does not allow trial and error looks in childhood like from a very early age, the child is trained not to try, but to get it right. The answer must be right, the handwriting must be right, the piano notes must be right, the behavior must be right, the reaction must be quick. Ideally, the first attempt is already correct. Mistake is not treated as part of exploration. Mistake is treated as carelessness, weakness, lack of discipline, lack of talent, sometimes even embarrassment. So the child does not learn how to test reality. The child learns how to avoid error. A society that cannot tolerate chaos looks in childhood like everything is scheduled, everything is planned, everything must have a stage, a target, a measurable direction. At what age to read, what age to start English, at what age to start piano, at what age to do Olympiad math, at what age to win something, at what age to prepare for the next level. If a child seems undefined, unfocused, in between, still searching, still changing, still confused, the adults panic. What should have been recognized as a natural stage of growth is immediately treated as delay, danger, or failure. Chaos is not seen as incubation. It is seen as a problem that must be eliminated. A society that does not respect imagination looks in childhood like you can never imagine that in some classrooms in China, cameras are installed to capture every student's face. And if a student looks up during so-called study time, they can be punished immediately. The moment you look up, it is treated as proof that you're not studying seriously. Of course, this is an extreme case. Imagination is allowed only as long as it does not interfere with performance. You may draw, you may tell stories, you may be creative, but only after the real work is done. Only if it does not affect the grades. Only if it can be converted into a prize, a certificate, a competition result, a useful skill. The child slowly learns that what matters is not what can emerge from the mind, but how efficiently the self can be fitted into an existing mold. I probably don't need to go through them one by one. You already know these patterns too well. So yes, such a child may become very impressive, but impressive in what sense? Impressive at answering questions, but not asking new ones. Impressive at completing paths, but not discovering them. Impressive at staying ahead, but not at getting lost. Impressive at winning, but less and less capable of becoming the kind of person from whom something truly original can emerge. That is why this is not just an economic issue, not just a political issue, not just a technology issue. It begins in childhood. It begins in the smallest reactions. And by the time people start asking why 0 to 1 is so rare, most of the conditions required for it have already been trained out of the person. 0 to 1 is not just hard work. 0 to 1 is wandering. 0 to 1 is waste. 0 to 1 is failed attempts that look stupid. 0 to 1 is ambiguity. 0 to 1 is having no guarantee. 0 to 1 is moving without proof. 0 to 1 is being willing to look wrong for a very long time. And that is exactly what this kind of growth system cannot tolerate. A child raised under intense control can become extremely strong at finishing tasks, optimizing with a structure, enduring pain, obeying external metrics, and competing inside known rules. But none of that guarantees the ability to generate something where no rule yet exists. In fact, very often, it destroys that ability. Because when a person grows up under constant pressure to be correct, useful, fast, and ahead, they do not develop love for uncertainty. They develop fear of it. They do not build imagination. They build caution. They do not build originality. They build strategic adaptation. And that is why going from 1 to 99 and going from 0 to 1 are almost opposite abilities. To go from 1 to 99, what do you need? Discipline, repetition, labor intensity, suppression of weakness, tolerance for monotony, hierarchy, command chains, standardization, willingness to push bodies and minds beyond healthy limits, the ability to obey a model and refine it under pressure. But that is not the same thing as invention. It is not the same thing as discovery. It is not the same thing as imagination. It is not the same thing as the first act of bringing a new structure into existence. This is where so much confusion begins. People see extraordinary competence in scale and assume it must also mean extraordinary competence in origin. No, those are different civilizational muscles. Sometimes they even weaken each other. A system built to minimize error becomes powerful at expansion, but weak at emergence. A culture built around certainty becomes efficient at copying, but fragile in front of mystery. A person trained never to fail becomes excellent inside existing maps, but almost incapable of drawing a new one. So when people talk about China's so-called 0 to 1, I think there are usually two very different situations, and neither one is the romantic myth people want to believe. The first situation is that once you have it, I can have it too. This is why open source systems matter so much. On the surface, open source looks fair. It looks like global equality. It looks like shared access. And in one sense, it is. But it also means that the moment the first breakthrough has been made somewhere else, a system with massive discipline, intense labor extraction, top-down coordination, and brutal execution can move with overwhelming force. Once the unknown has already been crossed by someone else, once the fog has already been entered by someone else, once the first path through the wilderness has already been cut by someone else, a replication machine can arrive and dominate the road. That is not 0 to 1. That is 1 to 99 using someone else's 0 to 1. And because the execution power is real, the results can be spectacular. Faster rollout, lower cost, more complete penetration, more aggressive iteration. Sometimes the original creator cannot compete anymore, not because the copier was more imaginative, but because the copier was built for pressure, endurance, and scale. The second situation is darker. You do not open it, you do not share it, you try to block access. But blocking access doesn't mean the system stops. It means the system changes tactics. In environments where dignity is tied to winning, where shame is unbearable, where face matters more than process, and where success is valued more than legitimacy, people become extremely inventive in the wrong direction. Not inventive in the direction of creation, but inventive in the direction of extraction. Not imaginative in the direction of possibility, but cunning in the direction of breach. A student who cannot solve the exam honestly may not accept not knowing. The pressure to preserve status becomes stronger than the obligation to stay with bounds. And that logic does not disappear in adulthood. It scales up with the person. It enters institutions. It enters markets. It enters technological competition. This is exactly why when people say China is finally doing 0 to 1, I think we need to slow down and ask a more brutal question. Is it real 0 to 1? Or is it stolen 0 to 1? And one of the most uncomfortable truths here is that a society can look highly inventive on the surface while relying underneath on a very weak respect for original ownership. This is where copyright matters. In many environments, copyright is not treated as a moral boundary. It is treated as an inconvenience, a technical obstacle, something flexible, something negotiable. Music, films, TV, software, books, images, courses, even fragments used casually in so-called secondary creation. People take, repost, cut, remix, repackage, monetize, and move on as if the original act of creation barely matters. Not because every individual is malicious, but because the surrounding culture has normalized extraction. If everyone is doing it, if enforcement is weak, if the social shame is low, if speed matters more than authorship, then theft no longer even feels like theft. It feels normal. This becomes even more important in the age of AI, when people discover that some Chinese models seem to produce impressively strong outputs. Many jump immediately to the conclusion that this must reflect the superior innovation. Maybe sometimes it does reflect engineering strength, maybe sometimes it reflects product decisions, but do not ignore another possibility. Models trained in an environment with far looser practical boundaries around copyrighted data may simply have access to vastly more unrestricted material. And if the main hard boundary is not copyright but political speech control, then the system may look unusually open in one dimension while remaining harshly closed in another. And this is why copyright is not a side issue. It goes straight to the center of the 0 to 1 question. A society that does not deeply honor the act of original creation will naturally become more comfortable feeding on creation than protecting it, more comfortable harvesting than inventing, more comfortable with access than with authorship. That can produce enormous short-term force. It can produce scale. It can produce market takeover. It can produce frightening competitive pressure, but it still reveals a deeper weakness. If your relationship to the new is primarily to seize it after someone else makes it, then your strength is still downstream. You may become extremely powerful after the birth of the thing, but you are still not the one giving birth. That is the difference. And that difference is everything. So, yes, the mind can become very effective, very fast, very adaptive, very resourceful. But resourcefulness without moral restraint is not the same thing as creativity. Intelligence without inner freedom is not the same thing as originality. The ability to penetrate barriers is not the same thing as the ability to bring something truly new into the world. That distinction matters because one creates civilization, the other exploits it. And I think this is where many people still refuse to be honest. They keep using one word, innovation to describe several radically different behaviors. But these behaviors are not the same. Discovering a new path is one thing. Optimizing an existing path is another. Reverse engineering is another. Exploiting openness is another. Breaking the fence because the fence exists is another. These are all mixed together under one flattering vocabulary, and as long as they remain mixed, people cannot see what is actually happening. Real creation requires the right to fail. Real creation requires the right to stop. Real creation requires useless time. Real creation requires detours. Real creation requires private obsession. Real creation requires protecting the strange, the slow, the unproven, and the embarrassing. Real creation requires a person who is not being watched every second by judgment, utility, rank, and punishment. And that kind of person is very difficult to grow inside a system built on pressure, comparison, obedience, and fear. This is why so many people from such environments appear powerful but internally remain trapped inside response mode. They are always reacting, adapting, optimizing, catching up, penetrating, maximizing, but response is not origin. Adaptation is not invention. Cleverness is not freedom. And freedom is expensive. Freedom means you may produce nothing for a while. Freedom means you may look ridiculous. Freedom means you may disappoint your parents. Freedom means you may walk away from a path that already works. Freedom means you may enter confusion without a guarantee that anything valuable will come out. That is exactly why so few systems truly allow it. And that is exactly why 0 to 1 is rare. That is why I do not look at ability to push something from 1 to 99 and automatically call it greatness. I first ask, where did the one come from? Who entered the fog first? Who tolerated the waste first? Who looked foolish first? Who risked having nothing first? Who paid the psychological price of uncertainty first? That is where the real mystery is. That is where the real power is. Again, China is powerful in a certain way. But if you want to call it the ruler of the world, then you may deeply misunderstand what the word ruler truly means. If the United States has long been recognized as the ruler of the world, that recognition did not come merely from 0 to 1, but also scaling. The American scaling is not human squeezing, but system scaling. Let's put it this way. Even when China really does flash a moment of 0 to 1, before we even get to financing or management, it is often already being undermined by the very lack of copyright awareness embedded in the society around it. In other words, in China, any genuine 0 to 1 creation faced with the lack of copyright protection across society and weak public awareness of copyright is almost destined to die in the womb. It is a perfect closed loop. So, if the United States has long been recognized as the ruler of the world, that came from something deeper. The power to begin, the power to build, the power to keep what was built alive. Truly amazing.